Welcome to lecture 24, where I'll be showing you some basic parameters for skin shading. As you know, skin shading can become very complex and very difficult to set up. This lecture will only focus on the most basic skin shading without any diffuse textures or roughness textures and stuff like that, because this stuff is not that easy to understand and to implement easily in a beginner course. So that being said, let's just jump right into it. On the left, you can see my 3D scan I have. It has actually some really nice detail on the skin. You can see some pores, you can see some bumpiness where the beard is, and you can see definitely some wrinkles around the eye area. And this is where the new random walk subsurface scattering shines in Arnold. So I have assigned a basic AI standard surface shader with my gray shader preset, which is just 18% gray, and it has some roughness to this. So previously we would be using a diffuse texture, plug it into the color, and then we introduce some color bleeding effect. With the new Arnold or the new diffusion model, what we can do is we can fully utilize subsurface scattering alone without worrying about the base. So what I like to do is just for now, just disable the base completely, and we should get a kind of a pretty black render, except that the specular component is contributing to the skin shininess. So before we start going into scattering, let's just play around with the roughness. So a roughness of 0.55 is actually pretty good already, but skin is sometimes a bit more shiny. And also there's a preset for skin which has a lower index of refraction, so it's not that shiny on the zero facing geometry. So it's mostly shiny on the edges. So 1.4 is pretty good. Let's just reduce the roughness maybe to 0.4. And we can see, okay, this might be a bit sweaty, but it's, yeah, let's just go maybe back up to 0.5. What if 0.6? Yeah, this is pretty dry skin, so I think it's something between 0.5 and 0.4 and 0.5. So let's just for now stick to 0.45 and just continue on the lecture. So as you might know already, subsurface scattering is very dependent on scale. What I mean by that is, depending how large your object is, the scattering behaves differently. So if you have an object which is 1 centimeter in scale and your shader in the scattering is also set to trace 1 centimeter or 1 unit, then the small cube will be fully scattering and will be almost translucent, like a jellyfish kind of texture. But let's say it's 10 centimeters or 10 units large, and you did not change the shader. What is happening now is that the ray will still enter the surface for 1 unit. So it will penetrate the object maybe as deep as this. If this is the whole object from the front, if it's set to 1 unit, the light will enter maybe as far as from the top up towards here. So the object will be a lot more solid looking, and it has some color bleeding from the top down. And the larger your object is, the less scattering you will get. So now 1 unit is pretty small. So for the whole object, 1 unit would be maybe this small. So this is just how it kind of works. And I hope it makes a bit more sense now. So my model here is around 30 centimeters in height, maybe 20 centimeters wide, and my Maya scene scale is set to centimeters, so my units are in centimeters. Making clear about the scale, let's jump into the attribute editor of the shader and check out the settings. So if I hit play in the render, we can see it's calculating its thing. And if I just zoom in a bit into the face area and I just render this area in the face, and let's just enable the weight to 1. So this is what I get with the typical default values and with the diffusion type. So they introduced a new type called random walk, which is a bit more accurate or it's actually a lot more accurate in smaller areas where you have close geometry to each other, which preserves a lot more detail. So let's switch to random walk. And now what we have to do is, because the scale is a bit different for this type, we should play around with the scale. A scale is kind of a multiplicator for the radius. So currently we have a radius of 1 and a color of 1. So the first thing which we should do is just introduce a color for the skin. So let's try something a bit orange, a bit more in the yellow side. I'm just checking at the color swatch for now, and maybe make it a bit more saturated, a bit darker. Something like this for the base maybe. And now let's just play around with the scale. So let's first of all put the scale to 0. So this kind of behaves now as a solid object, and you can see it's a lot faster to render because it is definitely not tracing any scattering. So what you can do now is actually set your scale to 0 and play around with the base color to get a desired texture for your skin. If you want to go a bit more on the cartoony side, you would have a bit more desaturated, something more like this on the left. Or if you want to have different kinds of skin types, you would definitely need to play around with your values here. Darker skin, lighter skin. So this is all up to you. And obviously, if you want to go for realistic texturing, you would need to plug in a map into the subsurface color. And so the next topic is radius. So what it's defining, if it's a desaturated grayscale value, it just defines how deep the light enters and how large the radius is which it scatters to. So typically if it's white, it's uniform, it will just get wider on the edges. So if I bring back some scale, maybe let's go 10%, 0.1. And now you can see, just by introducing this little scale jump, you can see that the ear is actually getting brighter. So on 0, it's pretty solid like this. And if I do a value of 0.2 for scale, you can see that there's definitely a fall off happening. It gets brighter on the edges where it's thin, but where the geometry is still thick, you can see it looks still very solid. So that is what scattering does. Thin surfaces, they let light through and it gets brighter. And just by doing that, you can see now that it looks very waxy and skin looking. Obviously, this is not perfect because skin is not white. It has actually blood cells in it. So the radius color should be more red than it is white. So a typical radius for skin color would be a RGB value of 1 unit in red, 0.35 in green, and 0.2 in blue. So this would be let's say an average color which you can work with for skin. What it means is red travels 1 unit, green travels 0.3 units, and blue travels 0.2 units. And then obviously it's multiplied by the factor of 0.2, so it's actually less than that. But the general idea is to set your measured values and then just play around with the scale. So if I have a scale on 1, on default, this is how it would look like with the scale of my object. So I still think that the ear should be a bit more bloody, more red. So what you can do now is either reduce these other colors by a bit, which I think we should do, or you can go to hue and go a bit more into the red tones, which is also something you can do. So by going a bit more red, more saturation maybe, you can see that the ear now looks a bit more bloody and more interesting looking. But overall, I would say it is way too translucent. There's way too much light going through, and you can actually see it very good on the nose area, that the light is going through and it's really blowing up the nose part. So let's just go 10% for scale. And now we should see something very interesting happening, that Now you see that the really thin parts in the nostrils, for instance, they get a bit of red on the bridge of the nose. You can see there is some red color bleeding on, especially on the wrinkles and on the eyebrows. You can see that there's some penetration of a red light coming through. And in the backlit ear, you can see that there is some red going on. I think 0.1 might be a touch too low, so maybe go 0.2, which might be again a bit too much. So maybe let's just go to split the difference of 1.15, and let's just render the whole image and see what we get. Alright, so now after the render is finished, you can actually see what it looks like, and I think the overall effect is pretty good. You can see there is a soft red bloodiness to the ear. You can see on the bridge of the nose there is some color bleeding going on, the same on the eyes, on the eyebrows as well. And obviously things like his cloth is also currently a skin shader, which looks weird, but you can definitely see on the edge of the cloth the color bleeding. So the main takeaway for this lecture is that scale is very dependent on your object's scale, which gets this shader assigned. So it's very important to play around with this scale factor and get the correct looking scattering. So my main tip is set the surface color of your base. You can make an alien color, which is green or whatever. This is your main diffuse or scattering color. And then when the ray enters the skin and it hits a certain depth, which is defined by the radius and the scale, then it will output this red color of the radius. So this is kind of how it works. So my main takeaway for skin shading is play around with these two values. And obviously, if you want to have your character to be more sweaty, more shiny, you should play around with the roughness of this. And if you want to also play around with some little sheen, you can do that as well. This will kind of fake peach fuzz, which is like the thin hair, the thin kind of facial hair we get on human faces. So this sheen will kind of mimic that. And let me just show you what this will look like. So I'm just storing this image quickly, and I'm changing my settings to be not adaptive anymore. Let's go back to 5 AA samples for here. So this would be my quick test settings. And if I just select this region and hit update the render, we should see them updating. Okay, so now let's just introduce some sheen and you can see what it actually does, which is also helping a lot, but this should be textured because you don't have really facial hair on the nose and stuff like that. So this is why I did not really show it in the lecture right now. But I must say this actually adds quite a bit. You can play around with the roughness. So the higher you put this, the more the white goes around to the front facing faces. So a value of 1 makes it pretty much white. But you can reduce the weight overall to get not a strong sheen overall. But I tend to play down the roughness to 0.2 or 0.3, which is, in my opinion, a good value. And then you can play around with the weight. So for peach fuzz, which is this facial hair, it's obviously a white value. But you need to be careful that it does not wash out your image too much. And now let's just compare this with the previous render. So with the sheen on top, this is kind of what you get. It just adds a bit more washed out image to this. But it's something you can play around with if this suits you. But it should only be in the facial hair region, so not really on the forehead, mostly on the sides of the cheeks and maybe on the neck a bit, above the lips, below the lips, some like the areas where you would see peach fuzz. And there's one more bonus which I can show you. So if you go to this website, you actually have a pretty good resource to play around with Arnold and skin shading with textures and bump maps and roughness map. So just go to this website or search for Digital Emily 2 in Google, and then you have the option to download this object. You get all the reference files, you get textures, bump maps. So I would recommend you to download this. Here are the maps actually at the bottom. Download this, plug this into the shader, and see what you get. If you have any questions with this workflow, please feel free to send me a message or post on the forums publicly or whatever, and I will be happy to help you. As this course is targeted to a more beginner audience, I didn't really want to go into full detail on how to create this effect or this shader. But on my YouTube channel, you can definitely see several tutorials on skin shading, actually with the Digital Emily 2. So if you are stuck, you can also go there and watch it on my YouTube channel. But all in all, this is what it is. And go to this website, check it out. It's all for free. And yeah, so I hope, first of all, that the basic tips helped you about the skin shading. Play around with the sheen, play around with the scale. And I hope you could take away something from this lecture. And thank you for watching. And I see you in the next section.